China didn't lose control of Manchuria because of a massive invasion force. It started with a railway line that barely stretched 700 kilometers. That's shorter than the distance between London and Paris and back again. And yet, by the time anyone in Nanjing fully processed what had happened, an entire region had been reclassified, renamed, and repurposed under a new state that technically didn't exist a year earlier. Manchukuo. Most people explain this as Japanese expansionism in the 1930 seconds. That's correct, but incomplete in a way that hides the actual mechanism. Because the real engine wasn't just the imperial army pushing outward. It was a small group of planners inside the Kwantung Army who understood something uncomfortable. Wars in the 20th century are not won at the front line. They are decided in rail junctions, customs offices, and supply depots before a single shot is widely reported. One of them, a staff officer named Ishiwara Kanji, didn't think in terms of battles. He thought in timelines. If Japan was going to survive what he believed was an inevitable clash with the United States and China, then China had to be destabilized early, structurally, almost surgically, not destroyed in one blow. Fragmented until resistance became mathematically impossible. And that's where the story shifts. Because what followed the Mukden incident in 1931 wasn't just occupation, it was system design. Railways were seized, rerouted, and repurposed faster than armies could respond. Local warlords were absorbed or neutralized not by force alone, but by control of logistics payments and fuel distribution. Entire cities began depending on infrastructure that no longer answered to the Chinese state. The unsettling part is how quiet it all was at first. No single moment looked like collapse. That's what makes it hard to map, even in hindsight. There's a tendency to imagine empires falling with noise. This one didn't. It unraveled through administrative decisions that looked, on paper, like routine security measures. And while this was unfolding, the central Chinese government was still dealing with internal fragmentation, warlord factions, weak fiscal control, and limited ability to project power into the northeast. That gap is what the Kwantung planners exploited. Not strength versus weakness, coordination versus delay. Here's the part that still divides historians. Some argue this was inevitable Japanese militarism expanding outward. Others point out something more precise, that a small cadre inside the military effectively dragged a reluctant state into expansion through manufactured incidents and rapid fait accompli decisions. Both are partially true, which is where the discomfort sits. Because if a handful of planners can shift borders faster than governments can respond, then the question stops being historical. It becomes structural. And one detail matters here more than most people realize. The Manchurian railway system wasn't just infrastructure. It was foreign-controlled legal territory operating inside China, with its own security forces and economic logic. That meant whoever controlled the rails controlled not just movement, but legitimacy. We'll come back to that. What matters next is how quickly this railway logic escalated into something far larger than Manchuria, and why even Tokyo struggled to rein it in once it started moving on its own momentum. My view on this is simple. This wasn't just imperial ambition. It was a case where administrative systems outpaced political control, and the empire started following its own machinery instead of its leaders. The part I'm still not fully certain about is how deliberate the escalation was from the very beginning. Whether Ishiwara and his circle fully understood they were setting off a chain reaction, or whether they convinced themselves they could contain it later. Either way, the system didn't stay contained. And what happened next is where the idea of limited expansion completely breaks down. Manchuria didn't collapse in a single political decision. It collapsed in invoices. That sounds almost absurd until you look at how the region actually functioned after 1931. The South Manchuria Railway Company wasn't just a transport line. It was a hybrid institution. part logistics firm, part intelligence network, part administrative state. It collected data on crop yields, tracked coal output, controlled freight pricing, and quietly determined which towns stayed economically alive. And once you control freight pricing, you don't need to issue political orders. You just make alternatives too expensive to survive. There's a document from the Kwantung Army's Logistics Bureau in the early 1932 that breaks down railway utilization not as infrastructure efficiency, but as population stabilization throughput. Cold wording, almost clinical, but it reveals the mindset. Railways weren't moving goods, they were managing societies. This is where Ishiwara Kanji's influence becomes more visible, not because he personally designed every system, but because the doctrine behind them reflected his core assumption. Modern war is decided before war officially begins. By the time armies clash, the outcome is already locked in by supply chains and economic dependence. And China, at this exact moment, was structurally exposed. Not weak in the abstract sense, fragmented in the literal one. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was still consolidating control over internal factions, dealing with warlords who controlled taxation in their own territories. So when Manchuria started drifting away, there was no single switch to flip to reverse it. Only delayed responses, diplomatic protests, and military plans that required resources the state didn't fully control. Meanwhile, something more subtle was happening inside Manchukuo itself. The new regime wasn't just occupation, it was experimentation. Japanese planners used it as a controlled environment for industrial policy, labor mobilization, and resource extraction at a scale they could not safely test inside the home islands. Coal from Fushun, iron from Anshan, grain flows redirected through railway tariffs instead of market demand. And this is the quiet mechanism most people miss. Tariffs replaced sovereignty. If a local farmer needed to ship grain and the only viable rail line set the price, then political allegiance stopped mattering. Survival economics took over. The state still existed on paper, but daily life was being negotiated with station managers and logistics officers. There's a human layer here that gets overlooked. A railway clerk in Mukden could, through pricing decisions, effectively determine whether a rural village prospered or starved that season. Not through malice necessarily, through policy. That's what makes the system harder to categorize morally. It wasn't just violence, it was administrative absorption. And while this was tightening in the Northeast, Tokyo was receiving conflicting reports. Some officials saw Manchuria as a strategic buffer. Others saw it as an uncontrolled liability that was dragging Japan toward broader conflict with China and eventually the United States. The problem was that once infrastructure systems reach a certain scale, they develop their own inertia. Reversing them becomes economically and politically more expensive than continuing them. Here's the open loop we left earlier. The South Manchurian Railway wasn't just foreign-controlled, it had legal extraterritorial status inherited from earlier treaties, which meant it operated inside Chinese territory with its own policing authority. That legal anomaly is what allowed a corporate military hybrid to function as a governing layer without ever declaring itself a government. That model didn't stay contained to Manchuria. It started influencing policy thinking in Tokyo itself, quietly shifting how planners understood occupation, logistics, and economic control. And this is where the reversal begins to take shape, because the system that looked like a tool of empire was starting to behave less like an instrument and more like a driver. My opinion on this stage is blunt. Japan didn't just expand into Manchuria. It built a machine there that began optimizing for its own logic: resource throughput, territorial stability, and strategic depth, regardless of whether political leadership could keep up with it. What I'm less certain about is whether the planners underestimated that inertia, or whether they believed they could always pull the brakes once the strategic objectives were met. The evidence suggests they were already losing that control. And once that happens with a system built on logistics, stopping it requires more than political will. It requires dismantling the arteries themselves, which is exactly what the next phase of escalation begins to test. There's a point in every expansion system where you stop being able to tell whether you're directing it or describing it after the fact. By 1933, that line in Manchuria had already blurred. On paper, Tokyo still issued directives. The Kwantung Army still reported upward. The South Manchuria Railway Company still answered to shareholders and ministries. But the actual flow of decisions, fuel allocation, rail scheduling, industrial siting, was increasingly determined inside Manchuria itself by administrators who were responding to local constraints faster than anyone in Tokyo could react. This is where the story stops looking like conquest and starts looking like drift. Not chaos, drift. A controlled system slowly losing its center of gravity. And here's the part that matters for understanding why China found it so hard to respond. Manchuria wasn't just taken, it was reorganized into a self-sustaining industrial loop. Coal from Fushun powered rail operations. Rail operations moved iron from Anshan. Iron fed manufacturing. Manufacturing supported rail infrastructure, each layer reinforcing the next. Break one piece and the rest still function for a while. That kind of structure doesn't collapse when you push it. It only fails when multiple links fail at once. Chiang Kai-shek's government attempted partial responses, diplomatic pressure at the League of Nations, limited military engagements like the defense attempts around Rehe. But those actions were operating at a different speed than the system they were trying to reverse. Diplomacy moved in months. Rail logistics moved in hours. And this mismatch is where the reversal begins to appear. Because while Japan was gaining functional control over Manchuria, it was also locking itself into commitments it could not easily scale down. Industrial output targets increased. Resource extraction became tied to military planning. The region stopped being a buffer zone and started becoming a dependency. There's a lesser-known 1,935 internal assessment from Japanese economic planners that noted something unusual. Manchuria was profitable in resource terms, but increasingly expensive in administrative overhead. Security forces, transport maintenance, and political stabilization costs were rising faster than output gains. It was, in economic language, a system with declining marginal returns. But militarily, it felt indispensable. That contradiction is where empires start making suboptimal decisions without realizing it. They don't misread the data. They reinterpret it through strategic necessity. Now, Ishiwara Kanji, who we left earlier as one of the architects of the early Manchurian strategy, began to diverge from the system he helped trigger. He increasingly warned that expansion beyond Manchuria, particularly into China proper, would overstretch Japan into a multi-front conflict it could not sustain. His concern wasn't moral hesitation. It was structural math. He understood something the operational system didn't want to hear. Logistics that work at regional scale often fail at continental scale. And yet, by the mid-1930s, escalation was already becoming self-reinforcing. Incidents along the Beijing-Tianjin corridor, rising military autonomy, and political fragmentation inside Japan itself meant that no single authority could easily pause the process. Each actor was responding rationally to their immediate incentives. Collectively, it produced strategic drift. This is the reversal point most traditional narratives miss. Japan didn't simply choose escalation over restraint. It entered a condition where restraint required coordination it no longer possessed. Meanwhile, inside China, something equally important was forming. Slowly, unevenly, but in response to exactly this pressure. Central authority began to harden. Alliances between previously fragmented factions started to shift, and the idea of national survival started to outweigh local autonomy in a way that hadn't existed before Manchuria's loss. So the system produced its own counter-system, not immediately, not cleanly, but structurally. Here's my view on this phase. Manchuria didn't just expand Japanese power, it exposed the limits of logistics-driven empire building. It showed that you can reorganize territory through infrastructure, but you cannot indefinitely suppress the political cost of doing so. The uncertainty I still sit with is timing. Whether collapse into wider war was inevitable once Manchuria was fully integrated, or whether different decisions in Tokyo around 1934 to 35 could have frozen the system in place as a contained buffer zone. The evidence leans toward inevitability, but it's not absolute. And that uncertainty matters, because what comes next is no longer about Manchuria alone. It's about what happens when a logistics empire stops being regional and starts testing the boundaries of a continent already learning how to resist it. By the time Japan crossed deeper into China in the late 1930s, Manchuria was no longer a question of expansion. It was a precedent. A working model that proved something dangerous. Territory didn't need to be formally annexed to be functionally absorbed. You just needed infrastructure control, pricing authority, and enough administrative overlap to make the old sovereignty irrelevant in daily life. But models have limits, and China, by this point, was no longer the fragmented system that made Manchuria easy. Something had changed in the pressure itself. The loss of the Northeast forced a recalibration inside Chinese political leadership that had been delayed for over a decade. The nationalist government began consolidating fiscal authority more aggressively. Military coordination improved not because institutions suddenly became efficient, but because survival removed the luxury of delay. Even fragmented actors begin to synchronize when the cost of non-coordination becomes existential. That shift matters more than most battlefield narratives suggest. Because Japan's system was still optimized for expansion through controlled increments, rail corridors, coastal seizures, resource nodes, but China was beginning to adapt to total system pressure, not localized loss. And here is where Ishiwara Kanji's earlier warning becomes almost uncomfortable in hindsight. He had argued internally that Japan's strategic depth had a ceiling, that once expansion crossed a certain threshold, the logistics that made Manchuria viable would begin to invert, becoming liabilities rather than advantages. Not because the system failed technically, but because the political cost of maintaining it would exceed the value extracted. He wasn't ignored because he was wrong. He was ignored because the system was already committed. This is the part that often gets flattened in popular retellings. The path to full-scale war wasn't a single decision point. It was a sequence of small, rational decisions that individually made sense and collectively eliminated alternatives. Each escalation narrowed the exit routes further, until continuation became the only operational choice left. Manchuria was the first irreversible step in that sequence. There's a quiet irony here. The very system designed to create strategic stability, rail logistics, industrial coordination, controlled resource extraction, ended up accelerating strategic instability at continental scale. Efficiency at one level produced fragility at another, and it raises a question that still matters today, far beyond the 1,930 seconds. How much control do you actually have over a system once it starts optimizing itself? My opinion is that Japan underestimated not China's resistance, but the compounding effect of its own infrastructure decisions. Manchuria was treated as a solved problem. In reality, it was a locked-in variable that reshaped every subsequent decision pathway. I'm not fully certain whether this was visible to decision-makers in real time or only becomes obvious in hindsight. Some archival material suggests awareness of overstretch. Other records suggest genuine belief that China would fragment further under pressure. Both interpretations coexist uneasily. What is clearer is the outcome. The logistical machine that made early expansion possible also made de-escalation structurally expensive. And once that happens, Policy stops being about choosing the best option. It becomes about managing the least damaging continuation. So if there's a final assessment here, it isn't about a single villain, despite how the title frames it. It's about a system that rewarded a specific kind of thinking, incremental control through infrastructure, and then outgrew the political framework needed to contain it. The person often associated with its early logic understood parts of this. He saw the limits coming before they fully arrived. But systems don't pause for early warnings once momentum takes over. And that's the uncomfortable ending. Not that empires rise or fall, but that sometimes they don't notice the moment they stop steering. My prediction is simple. If you map modern power competition today, whether in ports, data cables, semiconductor fabs, or satellite networks, you'll find echoes of this exact structure repeating in new materials. Different century, same mechanics. And the question I'll leave you with is this. When infrastructure becomes strategy, who actually holds the decision-making power? The state or the system it built?